Tonight, you don't have to do anything, not solve anything, not fix anything, not even try. All you need to do is lie back, let your breath slow, and let me tell you a story from long ago. A story that's gentle, quiet, and just strange enough to distract your brain while your body unwinds. We're heading into a different kind of hospital. Not the kind with heart monitors or IV lines, but one with stone walls, flickering gaslight, and steaming kettles full of something oddly sacred. Beef tea. Yes, that's real. Warm, salty broth served in tin cups to the weary, the broken, and the barely hanging on. And somehow, that strange little cup became a ritual of care, offered in silence, sipped by candlelight, and believed to hold life itself. Was it science? Not really, but it was human. It was the gentle act of trying when there was nothing else left to try. Tonight, as you rest, I'll guide you through quiet wards and rain-dimmed windows, through the lives of nurses who moved like ghosts and patients who clung to one more swallow. There's no rush, no loud moments, just the soft rhythm of a world trying to care for its sick, with the only thing it knew how to make, broth and presence. So if your mind is noisy, let it drift here. If your body is tired, let it melt into the bed. Let this story be the warm cup in your hands, steady, simple, and enough for now. Hey guys, tonight we wake in a long, echoing ward where the windows don't open and the sheets are barely sheets at all. A nurse with soot on her apron shuffles past, not quite looking at you. Somewhere close, but not quite close enough to feel comforting, a kettle lets out a tired wheeze. It's full of something that smells almost like soup, but not quite. It's salty, faintly meaty, slightly metallic. That's beef tea. And if you've woken up here, chances are you're dying. It's a strange kind of comfort, this lukewarm liquid served in cracked china cups. Not quite a meal, not quite medicine, but regarded, by doctors, nurses, and desperate relatives alike, as a kind of edible hope. The sort of thing you give someone when you don't know what else to give. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing the sleepy little map we build together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes again. Dim gaslight flickers on tile walls. You can smell vinegar, something slightly scorched, and a distinct undertone of boiled beef. It's not appetizing, it's not even properly food, but you've already had 3 spoonfuls today, maybe 4. It's hard to remember. Your sense of time is about as steady as the brass bed frame you're clinging to. This is a Victorian hospital, and you, unfortunately, are very much in it. You may have imagined hospitals in the 1800s as quaint places with stern but motherly nurses and polished wood floors. That's adorable. But no, in reality, you're in a ward that smells like urine and coal smoke. The beds are iron, the sheets were white at some point last century. And the food? Well, you're sipping it. Beef tea was the great medicinal mystery of the Victorian era. Clear, brown, oily on top, and considered by many to be a literal life-giving elixir. If someone collapsed in the street, they were given beef tea. If they had typhoid or pneumonia or a broken leg, or were simply tired, really tired, beef tea. It was universal, a culinary panacea. Doctors would note a patient's condition, scratch their chin, and say, "We'll start with beef tea, perhaps a pint, thrice daily." And that was the beginning of many a downward spiral. Not because beef tea was bad necessarily, but because it was all they had. You sip it again. It tastes like boiled despair, but the nurse nods encouragingly, as though you've just swallowed something holy. That's because in her world you have. To understand why, we need to rewind to a time when hospital didn't mean what it means now. In the early 1800s, hospitals were more like containment zones than centers of healing. They weren't where you went to get better. They were where you went when no one knew what else to do with you. Often run by religious institutions or charities, these places weren't designed for recovery. They were a mixture of almshouse, asylum, and plague quarantine. If your family couldn't care for you at home, Or if you didn't have family, you'd end up here, somewhere between forgotten and vaguely watched over. And in that twilight space of uncertain care, food played an odd role. There were no IVs, no antibiotics, no idea what a virus even was. What you had was nourishment. Or, more precisely, the Victorian belief in building strength through it. Which brings us back to the tea. Not your cozy peppermint or Earl Grey, no, this was beef tea. Thin, salty, and slightly translucent. It was made by simmering beef for hours, skimming off the fat, then reducing the liquid until you were left with something that looked like a shadow of stew and tasted like the ghost of a cow. In some hospitals, they added a spoonful of brandy. In others, nutmeg. One experimental ward swore by a squeeze of orange, though scurvy was already well past its fashion peak. Historians still argue whether the addition of sherry to beef tea counted as medicine or morale. You sit upright in bed now because the orderly says it's good for the lungs. Your pillow is stuffed with hay, the tea is lukewarm, and across the aisle another patient is being spoon-fed theirs like it's a precious potion. You're too tired to protest. It wasn't always this way. In the countryside, people still used old remedies, nettles, barley water, poultices that smelled like old feet and optimism. But in the cities, where industrial soot painted every brick, hospitals were trying something new, science. Except science didn't quite know what it was doing yet. The idea was simple. Beef is strong, therefore beef tea makes you strong. It was the same logic that led people to eat tiger bone or rhino horn in other places and eras, symbolism masquerading as nutrition. Vital essence, they called it. You were drinking the life of the animal. It was almost mystical. Some patients, too weak to chew or digest proper meals, were fed only this tea for weeks. Some recovered, others didn't. But in the minds of those who watched over them, that had more to do with fate than food. Still, not everyone agreed. A few rebellious nurses whispered that the tea did nothing, that it was just warm water with beef residue, that patients needed food, not soup pretending to be salvation. But then again, what was food when you could barely swallow, when your stomach clenched at even the sight of bread? Beef tea slid down easy, and that was enough. One particularly grim hospital, no names, but let's just say the nickname was The Great, even had a dedicated tea room, not for staff, for simmering the broth. The whole room was tiled in soot, a single window propped open by a ladle, and the cauldron was never cold. A man was employed full-time just to stir. He was known only as Cook John. He wore a cap that might have once been white and spoke to no one but the beef. They said he could tell if a patient would survive based on how fast they finished their cup. Probably not true. But then again, you just coughed up something worrying, so maybe now's not the moment for skepticism. Across the decades, as medicine progressed, beef tea clung on. Like a superstition that became habit, like a bedtime story you still half believe. Even as real food entered hospitals, milk, porridge, bread with jam, there was always a pot of beef tea on somewhere. Waiting, simmering, steaming. It was tradition. It was comfort. And sometimes, it was the last thing you tasted. You shift slightly under the coarse hospital blanket, and a pinch of straw pokes through the ticking to jab your skin. The cup of beef tea cools in your hand, the oil on its surface forming soft rainbows in the flickering gaslight. You're not the only one awake in this ward. Someone 2 beds over is muttering about dogs in the walls again. The night nurse gives them a glance, long enough to signal attention, short enough to signal futility. Welcome to the great birthplace of modern healthcare. And by birthplace, of course, we mean something closer to a crime scene. Because if you had the misfortune of getting sick in the early 1800s, and worse, if you were poor, you didn't walk into a hospital. You were dropped off like laundry. Early Victorian hospitals were often converted workhouses or church-run infirmaries. There were no emergency rooms, no buzzing intercoms, no cheery pastel walls. Instead, imagine thick stone walls coated in grime, echoing corridors that funneled cold air like wind tunnels, and rooms that smelled of coal, old blood, and boiled mutton. Or boiled something. You drag your feet across the tile toward the privy and hope the rats aren't active. They tend to get braver when the gas lights are dimmed. The word hospital comes from the Latin hospes, meaning guest or host. But if you were a guest in one of these early institutions, you weren't expected to leave, not in a good way anyway. These places existed less to heal and more to contain. Disease was messy. People died slowly and often loudly. So the logic went, why not put them all in one place, preferably one with thick doors and high windows? Charity hospitals like St. Bartholomew's or Guy's in London were crowded, chaotic, and frequently dangerous. You were as likely to catch something new as you were to get treated for what you came in with. Historians still argue whether these early institutions prolonged life or just documented death more carefully. There were wards for women, wards for men, sometimes a fever wing, and always the surgical theater. If you've ever imagined a theater with red velvet curtains and balconies, you're not wrong. Surgeries were public events. Medical students crowded in, leaning over railings to watch someone get their legs sawn off. No anesthesia, of course, because that was still considered experimental. If you survived the procedure, you were wheeled, more likely dragged, back to a communal bed. And what awaited you? You guessed it, a hot cup of beef tea. That's because recovery wasn't about rest. It was about appearance. You needed to look like you might survive. Rosy cheeks, clear eyes, and a steady appetite were considered good signs. So the hospital kitchens worked day and night to ladle up things that might, just might, give you a bit of color. Enter beef tea. It was light enough for a failing stomach, dark enough to feel substantial, and just salty enough to trick you into thinking you'd eaten. If you looked livelier after a sip, your chart got a little smiley note. If you didn't, well, back to bed. Maybe with a mustard plaster this time. Mustard plasters, by the way, were exactly what they sound like. Cloth soaked in mustard seed paste and slapped on your chest until your skin turned red and blistered. Stimulating, they said. Awful. You'd probably respond, if you had the strength. Not everyone got the same cup of tea. That's important. In hospitals, as in life, your class mattered. The poor, those brought in from the streets or transferred from workhouses, were given the thin stuff, barely more than beef-flavored water. A single cow could stretch its ghost across dozens of servings. But if you were middle class, or, gasp, had a letter of referral from someone respectable, you might get stronger broth. Richer, more marrow, maybe even accompanied by toast. Crust removed, royal treatment. Some of the finest hospitals had different kitchens for different patients. Yes, even in illness, the class system kept ticking. Quirky fact, in some private wards, beef tea was served in fine porcelain cups with lace napkins. The same stuff, just prettier. Florence Nightingale herself once noted that the appearance of food is as vital as the food itself. She meant well. But when you're clutching a tin mug in a bed that smells like moldy straw, the idea of aesthetic presentation seems aspirational. Let's not forget the smells. You're probably trying to. But this is Victorian medicine, and the nose always suffers. The reek of phenol, an early disinfectant, the sour tang of sweat-soaked wool, the lingering hint of laudanum, that's opium, by the way, and always the background musk of overcooked beef, because these kitchens never stopped. Giant black cauldrons hissed from dawn until long after dark. If you had the energy to shuffle down the hallway, you might glimpse them, rows of stained pots, grease clinging to the edges, beef bones stacked like firewood nearby. One apocryphal tale tells of a cook who used the same bones for 3 weeks straight, just added more water. When someone asked if the tea was still nourishing, he reportedly grinned and said, "Aye, there's still spirit left in the bones." Not comforting. And yet, people swore by it. There's a kind of psychological warmth to beef tea. Imagine being cold all the time, really cold. Bone deep, can't wiggle your toes cold. Imagine your stomach is too queasy for bread, too sore for porridge. But the nurse brings you something hot, salty, easy to swallow. You close your eyes and sip. It doesn't taste good, no, but it tastes safe. That alone is worth a lot. Some doctors even wrote poems about it. Not good poems, mind you, but passionate ones. One anonymous surgeon referred to beef tea as the steam of hope, the broth of renewal. Another described it as liquid fortitude for those whose flesh fails, makes you want to pour it over your cereal. Others were less sentimental. One 1860s physician wrote in his case notes, "Patient improved slightly following broth, or perhaps the rats moved to the next bed." We'll never know. The problem, of course, was that most people didn't get better. Not really. Hospitals were more like final destinations than way stations. So the logic was, if we can't save them, let's at least make them comfortable. Beef tea was comfort. And that's where it gets strange. Because slowly, imperceptibly, this thin liquid took on symbolic weight. It became the thing you gave the dying. Not morphine. Not morphia. Same thing, different name. Not even a priest, unless you remembered in time. No, the thing you made sure they got before the end was beef tea. It wasn't nutritious. It wasn't medical. But it was ritual. You lie back now, staring at the ceiling. The tea is gone. The cup is still warm in your hand. Across the room, someone is sobbing softly, not from pain, but from something vaguer. Loneliness, regret, hunger perhaps, or the knowledge that they might not wake up again. And yet, in the corner, a fresh pot is bubbling, the same steam, the same faint hope, the same mistake repeated out of kindness. That's Victorian medicine for you. Equal parts nonsense, care, and clinging to tradition. The next morning comes not with sunlight, but with the sound of coughing, rattling, wet, insistent, the kind that echoes off tiled walls and makes you feel as though the room is shrinking inward, pulling all the bad air to the center and making you drink it. You sit up, or try to. Your ribs feel like they've been stitched together with wire. And there it is again, the cup. A faint puff of steam, a chip in the rim, and the oily swirl of brown liquid you're now learning to recognize as the Victorian equivalent of a balanced breakfast. Today's beef tea tastes saltier. Maybe there's more essence in this batch. Maybe Cook John fell asleep with the bones on the boil again. Or maybe it's just your imagination. The hallucinations do tend to spike around day 3. No one tells you what's wrong with you. That would require a diagnosis. And Victorian medicine, as a rule, loved procedure far more than it loved clarity. You should know, beef tea didn't arrive in this world alone. It joined a rather spectacular cast of treatments that sound more like dares. Bloodletting, for instance, yes, still popular in the 1800s, wasn't just for the overly dramatic. It was a standard prescription for everything from gout to heartbreak. A quick nick at the elbow or behind the knee, a ceramic bowl, and out poured your illness, supposedly. If that didn't do the trick, there were leeches. Whole families of them, kept in glass jars and trained for bedside service. They didn't wear little nurse hats, sadly. Just teeth. So many teeth. And then, of course, there was blistering. If you had inflammation, they'd slap on a mustard plaster, or worse, cantharides, derived from Spanish fly, which raised hideous blisters on the skin. Why? Because the logic was, if your body focused on one injury, it might forget the other. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely believed or simply the result of desperation and wishful thinking. In this parade of torment, beef tea might seem almost gentle. It didn't blister. It didn't suck your blood. It didn't require your groin to be lanced open by an eager young doctor with a trembling hand and a dull scalpel. Beef tea just existed. It was warm. It stayed down. That was more than could be said for many things in this building. The Victorians loved the idea of balance. They believed illness came from an imbalance in the body's natural forces, humors, energy, phlogiston, and whatever else happened to be trending that year. You were too hot or too cold, too dry or too moist, and food could restore you. So when your body was weakened, beef tea was the answer. Not heavy like stew, not indulgent like roast, but stripped down, purified strength, the spirit of the cow divorced from fat and gristle. It was, in a very real sense, beef for ghosts. Let's talk about how it was made. Don't worry, we'll keep it light. First, you'd need beef. This might come from the haunch of a cow, or more often the scrappy offcuts the butcher couldn't sell. You'd trim off anything resembling fat. That was seen as indulgent, even dangerous. Then you'd dice the meat, Sometimes chop it so finely it resembled ground paste. Next, you'd place it in a pan with water, cold at first, and maybe a pinch of salt. No garlic, no herbs. This wasn't cuisine, this was pharmacy. Then you'd simmer, not boil, simmer, for hours. You wanted the juices to weep out slowly, coaxed by heat and time. If it boiled, the tea was ruined, and if it cooled too fast, it congealed into something that looked distressingly like a melted candle. You skimmed the top, filtered it through muslin, poured it into earthenware jugs, and then you prayed. Sometimes over the tea, sometimes just in general. Quirky tidbit. In some wealthier hospitals, they even had beef extractors, strange pressurized contraptions that compressed cow chunks into high-concentration goo. A teaspoon of this, diluted with water, made for instant beef tea. It was the Victorian equivalent of a bouillon cube, only grosser. You sip yours again. Lukewarm now. It slid to the bottom of the cup like a brown memory. But the nurse smiles at you. That's something. The beef tea was often delivered by women, nurses, housemaids, matrons, who moved through the wards like quiet ghosts armed with trays and folded towels. Florence Nightingale insisted that these women wear neat uniforms and move with grace, but hospitals were short on grace and shorter on uniforms that weren't frayed. Sometimes, when a patient was particularly close to the end, the nurses would make the tea stronger, just a little. An extra scoop of marrow, a heavier pour, a nod of acknowledgement. This was end-stage kindness. One nurse, Eleanor or Ellen, depending on the account, was said to whisper over each cup, "Just a sip, just one, the rest can wait." It became a kind of ward-wide lullaby. Not everyone believed in it. A few doctors, the radicals, the contrarians, called it nutritional theater. They believed patients needed calories, not symbols. One surgeon even did a calorie count of a standard beef tea recipe and found it contained less sustenance than half a slice of bread. That didn't stop anyone. In fact, as beef tea became more fashionable, it spread beyond hospitals, into homes, into asylums, into the royal court. Queen Victoria herself was said to have taken beef tea when ill. It was served in delicate porcelain, accompanied by thin toast and the occasional prayer. If it was good enough for the monarch, it was certainly good enough for you. Or so they said. You're sweating now. Not from fever, though that's debatable, but from the weight of too many blankets. Someone decided you were too pale, so the standard Victorian cure is underway. Pile on more wool and hope your color improves. This is called restorative warmth. You are, in theory, being gently baked back to life. You'd complain, but the nurse is already on her way with another cup. You wonder if the tea tastes different when you're not dying. Probably not. In a nearby ward, a child is moaning in his sleep. His mother sits beside him, wrapped in the same borrowed blanket she arrived with 3 days ago. She clutches a tin mug in both hands, watching the steam curl. She hasn't touched it. Maybe she's waiting for him to wake up. Maybe she knows he won't. Hospitals are quiet like that, full of hope, full of lies. In some corners of the country, local healers still scoffed at this hospital nonsense. Beef tea, they'd say, just give the lad a warm ale and let him sleep. But Victorian doctors clung to their broths with the fervor of true believers. And to be fair, sometimes people did get better, not because of the tea, probably not even in spite of it, but because the body, against all odds, wants to live. And when it finds a reason, any reason, even a warm sip of something vaguely meaty might be enough to keep it going. That's the secret. Not nutrition, not medicine, but meaning. You tip your cup. It's empty now. Somewhere in the shadows, Cook John stirs another pot. You can hear it, the slow scrape of ladle against steel. It's steady, reassuring. The sound of tradition, even if it's wrong. And tomorrow, you'll probably drink it again. You wake with a start, coughing. Not because of the illness, though that's still lingering, but because someone has lit the gas lamp too close to your bed again. The fumes are sweet and sharp, like an argument you can't quite win. And then, as always, comes the cup. It's there before your eyes can fully focus. Placed gently on the small tray beside your cot. the surface still steaming faintly in the morning chill. The nurse doesn't say anything. She just nods. The nod means, "You're still here. Drink your tea. We'll see what happens after that." "What's in the cup today?" "The same. Always the same. Beef tea." Only now, you're starting to understand why it wasn't just about the liquid. It was the gesture, the ritual, the way a nurse's hand didn't shake when she placed it beside you, that quiet confidence. This helps. This matters. And to a surprising number of people in the 19th century, it really did. Beef tea wasn't a fringe remedy. It was front and center. Entire books were written on its virtues. Doctors gave lectures on its preparation. Newspapers advertised the finest beef extracts for invalids and travelers, and cookbooks printed whole chapters about its various forms: clear, jellied, fortified, or infused with port. The Victorians were obsessed because they were obsessed with weakness. And not just physical weakness, moral, emotional, spiritual. The body and soul were thought to be intertwined, and beef tea promised to soothe them both. It was prescribed for women after childbirth, for men recovering from fever, for children too delicate to chew solid food. It was given to soldiers, prisoners, tuberculosis patients, and convalescents of all types. And sometimes, it was the only thing anyone ate for days. That's where the spoon came in. Not everyone could lift a cup, so nurses, or more often underpaid housemaids, fed it by the spoonful, slowly, carefully. You can picture it now, the tin spoon clinking lightly against the edge of a china bowl, the patient too weak to do more than open their mouth. A spoonful of strength, they called it. And while we might roll our eyes today, in a world of protein shakes and intravenous drips, back then it meant something. Each sip was effort, each swallow a small victory. Florence Nightingale, during the Crimean War, insisted her nurses keep exact records of every spoon fed to a patient, how many ounces they took, whether they gagged, whether they looked less pale after. She believed fiercely that beef tea was essential. Good beef tea, she wrote, should be of the color of sherry, clear and bright, not greasy, and possessing a rich aroma of fresh meat. She had opinions, strong ones. Still, not all tea was created equal. The kitchens where it was made varied dramatically. In some hospitals, it was prepared in giant soot-covered kettles, thick with years of grime and the ghosts of failed recipes. In others, it was daintily assembled by upper-class ladies volunteering as lady nurses, their first time in any real kitchen. There were contests, yes, actual competitions to see which ward could produce the clearest, most fragrant beef tea. It was a point of pride. Quirky fact, one recipe from 1863 suggests simmering the beef in a bottle placed inside a kettle of boiling water, essentially a Victorian sous vide. It claimed the resulting tea retained the pure lifeblood of the cow's vigor. Not weird at all. You're sipping again. Not because you're hungry, but because you're supposed to. That's the difference. Beef tea wasn't just food, it was compliance. It was a way for the patient to show the nurse, "I'm trying, I want to live," and for the nurse to show the doctor they're still responding. They drank the tea. It became a kind of feedback loop. One case file from 1879 describes a man with severe malaise and disordered constitution who refused solid food but tolerated beef tea favorably. He was kept on it for 11 days. On the 12th, he asked for toast. He lived. Was it the tea? Probably not. But was it the only thing he could keep down? Absolutely. Historians still debate whether beef tea had any true medical efficacy or whether its power lay entirely in its gentleness. Either way, it became a cornerstone of bedside care. And so it became social too. Hospitals didn't just serve beef tea to patients. They served it to visitors, to mourners, to staff, late at night. It was the warm liquid version of "I'm so sorry, but we're doing our best." In fact, many middle-class homes began keeping beef tea on hand for guests who seemed unwell. It was considered good manners. You'd walk into a parlor looking peaky and be offered a cup, no questions asked. It even crossed into fiction. Victorian novels mention characters being revived by a few spoonfuls of strong beef tea. It became a shorthand for frailty and recovery. Some people swore by it for hangovers, others for heartbreak, and still others, well, some just liked the taste. There were regional differences, of course. In the north, it might be served darker, saltier, with a glug of beer. In London, clearer and finer, like consommé. In Scotland, they sometimes thickened it with oats. In India, where the British Empire extended its long colonial fingers, beef tea was shipped in crates, dehydrated into cakes. Army doctors swore by them. One report from 1887 details a soldier revived in the sweltering heat of Bengal by a single pint of beef tea mixed with lime juice. Whether he actually revived or just stopped sweating is unclear. But the legend grew. Meanwhile, back in your ward, the tea has cooled again. You eye it, consider pushing it aside, but you know the nurse will just bring more. You don't have the heart to argue. And maybe, deep down, a part of you doesn't mind. It's not comforting exactly, but it's familiar. And in this place, familiarity is about as close as you get to hope. Tomorrow, maybe you'll feel stronger. Maybe you'll ask for bread. Maybe you'll get a full meal. Or maybe you'll just sip again and again and again until you stop noticing the taste. That's the thing about rituals. They become their own logic. Beef tea became a loop of care. A nurse bringing it, a patient sipping it, a chart being updated, a doctor nodding, a cook ladling the next pot. Did it work? Sometimes. Maybe. Not really. But it did what Victorian medicine most wanted to do. It made everyone feel like they were doing something. And when faced with death, even that can be a kind of victory. The ward smells different today. Not better, just sharper. There's something sour beneath the usual odors of lye, sweat, and steam. You suspect it's cabbage. Someone down the hall must have graduated from tea to solids. That's what passes for good news here. Your own tray arrives right on time. No cabbage for you, just the same chipped mug, the same thin broth, the same nurse with the same expressionless nod. But something's different now. You've been here long enough to notice things. The way the tea gets stronger after a good night. The way it's barely warm when they expect you to sleep soon. It's not just nutrition anymore. It's a message. And the place it comes from, the hospital kitchen, is starting to feel more important than the tea itself. Let's follow it back, shall we? Past the moaning patient with the cracked chamber pot, past the orderly arguing with a nun, down a narrow corridor that smells like coal and onions, and there, behind a groaning wooden door, the kitchen. It's not a cheerful place. No hanging copper pans, no white-aproned chefs dicing herbs with a flourish. This is an industrial belly of the beast. Steam clings to every surface. The floor is always wet. Rats are always hypothetical until they're not. In the center stands the great cauldron, blackened, heavy, often half full of bubbling broth. Beside it, slabs of raw beef stacked on wooden counters, hacked roughly into cubes with cleavers that haven't been cleaned quite as often as you'd prefer. There is no formal recipe, no delicate seasoning. The cook, who may or may not have medical training, spoiler, not, works from memory and habit. A certain color, a certain smell, a certain sigh when it's ladled into the cup. This is where the beef tea begins. Hospitals often hired cooks specifically for the beef tea operation. Some were retired army cooks used to preparing rations for thousands. Others were failed butchers. One memorable character at St. George's was nicknamed Gallons, not because of his size, but because that's how much he could prepare before breakfast. He claimed he could tell a patient's fate just by how long the tea simmered. 6 hours for the stubborn ones, he'd say, but the ones who ain't meant to make it, 10 minutes'll do. Historians still argue whether these cooks had any medical insight, or whether they were just the hospital's version of bartenders, pouring out quiet comfort, one ladle at a time. The pots themselves were rarely scrubbed. It was believed the old residue seasoned the next batch. And since the broth was strained before serving, nobody worried much about the grime, at least not officially. One 1885 inspection report describes a hospital kitchen in Manchester where the same bones were used for 3 separate days. On the 4th, they were ground down and added to gruel for the poorhouse next door. Efficiency, that was the word of the century. And besides, no one ever asked the patients how it tasted. That wasn't the point. The serving process was, ironically, more structured than the preparation. Each cup was logged. Names were checked. Wards timed their deliveries down to the minute. Some nurses even kept logs. Ounces consumed, time taken, visible expressions of revulsion, ranked from mild grimace to attempted hurling. These were actual metrics. These, Florence Nightingale herself pioneered this style of data-driven nutrition. She insisted every patient's intake be documented with military precision, even if that meant noting 3 spoonfuls, then refusal due to choking, or half cup taken, complained of metallic taste. By the way, that metallic taste, that wasn't just imagination. In many hospitals, the kettles were lined with tin or lead. Over time, the metal leached into the tea, giving it a tang reminiscent of pennies and poor decisions. And yet, they kept drinking, even when it went cold, even when it looked like pond water, even when the meat came from questionable sources. Yes, including horse in times of shortage, patients clung to it. Why? Because it was warm, and because it was something. In a hospital where silence was the loudest sound, beef tea became a ritual of reassurance. It was also practical. Thin enough not to strain a stomach, salty enough to encourage fluid retention, served hot enough to mask other flavors. In fact, the beef tea sometimes carried more than just flavor. In a few desperate wards, alcohol was secretly stirred in, not for effect, but for kindness. A nurse at Middlesex Hospital once confessed to adding brandy only when they're near the end. No one reported her. Let's not pretend it was all angelic. There were problems, lots of them. For one, contamination was rampant. The very same spoon used to feed one patient might be used on the next, rinsed in nothing more than lukewarm water between uses. And remember Cook John? He wasn't always sober. Some nights the tea was oversalted, other nights it was barely brewed. And nobody questioned it because nobody wanted his job. Some hospitals outsourced the process entirely. In 1871, one London hospital started ordering pre-made beef essence from a local supplier. It arrived in jars labeled with dates and dosages. Most of it was expired. One particularly scathing newspaper article dubbed it Bovril for the nearly dead, a nickname that, against all odds, actually boosted sales for the company that made it. Speaking of which, beef tea wasn't just a hospital thing anymore. It had gone mainstream. Vendors hawked it on street corners in paper cups. Middle-class families brewed their own, keeping small kettles near the fireplace for invalids and children. Soldiers carried beef extract in tins. Explorers, too. When Ernest Shackleton's Antarctic team was stranded, they rationed out jars of Liebig's extract of meat like sacred relics. It was no longer food, it was identity. To be British was to believe in beef, not roast, not steak, not burgers. Beef in tea form, portable, respectable, medicinal. And you? You're part of that lineage now. Like it or not. Your tea is cooler than usual today. Maybe the kitchen was late. Maybe the fire went out. Maybe Cook John is gone and nobody's noticed yet. But it still arrives. In its cracked cup, with its little film of oil, still warm enough to steam your hands if you cup it gently. You sip, you breathe, you close your eyes. This isn't healing, not really, but it's something. And in this place, something matters more than truth. You aren't better, but you're still here. And tomorrow, there'll be another cup. You wake before the nurse arrives this time. The ward is quieter than usual, just the occasional cough, the faint creak of an old floorboard, and the slow, distant hiss of something being stirred. Maybe the tea. Probably the tea. You swing your legs off the bed and wince, not from pain, but from the sheer indignity of the floor's chill. It seeps up through your bones like doubt. You reach for your cup before it's even brought. You know it'll be there soon. And sure enough, the tray clinks beside your bed. No words, no greetings, just the handoff. You nod in return. A small agreement, a ceremony between strangers. You hold it now. Warmth seeps into your fingers. The smell, meaty, faintly metallic, oddly comforting, rises toward your face like steam from a forgotten dream. This is your breakfast. Again. You aren't alone. Across the room, someone else is being fed. Not given, not handed, but fed, spoon to mouth. A woman with her head bandaged and her hands too weak to hold anything. A nurse kneels beside her, not sitting, kneeling, so that their eyes meet level and the spoon doesn't have to travel far. She doesn't resist, she swallows. Slowly, deliberately, as though every gulp might buy her another minute in this world. Beef tea wasn't always served like this. In fact, the history of bedside feeding is, well, let's say uneven. For much of the early 19th century, if a patient couldn't feed themselves, that was considered an ominous sign, not of illness, but of attitude, laziness, weak character. Seriously, Victorian medicine was obsessed with willpower. The idea that a strong moral fiber could beat infection, pain, even death. And food, especially beef tea, was a test of that strength. This is where the nurses came in, particularly the new wave. Women trained not only to administer medicine, but to observe, to record, to nourish. Florence Nightingale called food the second medicine. The first, in her view, was cleanliness, but food was a close second, and the way it was given, just as important. She trained her nurses to feed the dying with dignity, no rushing, no tilting the cup like it was a punishment. Every spoonful was to be measured, observed, logged. Some hospitals even designed special feeding cups, porcelain with long, curved spouts, so that patients didn't have to sit up to sip. These became status symbols. If you had one, it meant you were being watched, carefully, kindly. And if your tea was warm, that meant someone still believed you might live. You look at your own cup again. The rim is stained slightly darker than yesterday. That's not a good sign. Either the dishwashing team is cutting corners, or the tea is stewing too long. But you drink, not because you like it, but because it doesn't hurt. That's a high bar around here. You think about the woman across from you, the spoon, the bandages, the nurse with the steady hand. In this place, touch is rare. Touch means someone's trying. There are patients who haven't been touched in days, except to have their bedding changed, their temperatures taken, or their charts updated. But spoon feeding, that's something else. It's care, intimate, deliberate, human care. Quirky tidbit. In one hospital, nurses were encouraged to hum while feeding patients. Not because it helped digestion, though someone probably argued it did, but because it softened the awkwardness. A lullaby for the mouth. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it made things weirder, but it was an effort. A sign that someone wanted this moment to matter. Historians still debate whether these rituals, spoon, song, eye contact, actually affected survival rates, but they unquestionably affected the patient. Because when you're fading, the way someone looks at you, the way they tilt the spoon, the way they warm the cup in their hands first, it matters. It says, you are still here. Of course, not everyone was gentle. Some nurses were overworked, underpaid, exhausted, angry. There are reports of trays dropped carelessly, of tea so hot it burned, of spoons jabbed rather than offered. In one notorious case from 1874, a patient's death was blamed on scalded throat tissue. The tea had been boiling. The nurse had been in a hurry. The family sued. The hospital denied. The nurse disappeared. But those were exceptions. Mostly, beef tea was one of the few gentle things in the building. It was a daily rhythm, a quiet murmur beneath the chaos of amputations, infections, and grief. And yet, it wasn't always enough. A patient could drink every drop, swallow every spoonful, smile through the salt and bitterness, and still fade. One nurse wrote in her journal, "He drank the tea. He thanked me. He asked if there would be more tomorrow. I said yes. He died during the night." There's a helplessness in that, a kind of ache, because tea gave the illusion of progress. A sip meant hope. A request for more meant momentum. But bodies don't always care about symbols. You're back in your bed now. You've finished the cup. The nurse takes it away without comment. She moves to the next bed where someone else is waiting, or pretending to wait. You close your eyes. You think of all the people who've sat in this bed before you, held this cup, wondered whether the next sip would taste like life or like giving up. Maybe they thought of their mother's stew. Maybe they remembered Sunday roast. Maybe they imagined a future where food had flavor again. Maybe that was enough. You're not dying. Not yet. At least not more than usual. But you've started to notice the way the tea tastes different each day. Not in flavor. There's never much of that. But in meaning. Some days, it's fuel. Other days, it's routine. And occasionally, like today, it's a tether. Something that says, you're still part of the world. Tomorrow, it'll come again. And whether you drink it in gulps or sips, alone or from a spoon, with hope or just because it's expected, you'll drink it, and the ward will nod along, as if that little cup is holding you in place. The night settles like a weight on the ward, heavy, slow, unwilling to move. The gas lamps flicker lower, their dim halos barely reaching the corners of the room. Somewhere outside, a horse-drawn cart rattles past, probably delivering coal or taking someone away. You try not to think about it. You've been here long enough to know the rhythm now, the groan of metal bed frames, the slosh of water being poured into basins, the whispers between nurses when they think no one's listening, and always the clatter of the kitchen ladle. The same sound, different hour. You can't sleep, so you lie still, tracing the cracks in the ceiling plaster with your eyes. And that's when you hear it, the soft, deliberate footsteps, not rushed, not hesitant, calm, familiar. The door creaks open, and in comes the night nurse with a cup. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. It's beef tea. Again. Let's talk about Florence Nightingale. You've heard the name, maybe even seen the famous oil painting. Her head bowed, a lamp in her hand, gliding through corridors like a Victorian saint. It's poetic, it's misleading, because Florence wasn't gentle in the way you might think. She was stern, unyielding, obsessed with order, sanitation, and numbers. She counted everything: bowel movements, temperatures, teaspoons, hours of daylight, square inches of ventilation, and most of all, she counted food. During the Crimean War, she took over the kitchens of the British field hospitals and completely reorganized them. Beef tea became a staple, not just because it was familiar, but because she could control it. It was measurable, trackable. She issued strict instructions on preparation. The meat must be lean, the water pure, the vessel covered, the heat low, the liquid clear. No flair, no guesswork, just method. Always method. Historians still argue whether Nightingale's reforms were driven by genuine health improvements or just by her own need for control. But the fact remains, hospital kitchens changed because of her. Before Florence, the kitchen was an afterthought. After her, it was a battlefield. A war waged on disease through ladles and cauldrons. She published recipes, charts, case studies. She even corresponded with German chemists about the precise chemical breakdown of beef essence. And she insisted that hospitals, not just military ones, but civilian wards too, serve beef tea not only as nourishment, but as protocol, a sign of discipline, of order, of intention. You sip now, wondering if your nurse trained under one of her disciples. She moves like someone who learned precision. She checks your eyes, your pulse, then nods, not kindly, not coldly, but with practiced reassurance. You nod back. It's an exchange, not friendship, not even empathy, but recognition. She leaves the cup beside you and moves on. You hold it for a moment, letting the heat settle in your hands. The tea is slightly different tonight, a little richer, stronger. You suspect it came from a fresh pot. Maybe the kitchen had extra meat today. Maybe a patient didn't need theirs anymore. You try not to think about that. Quirky fact: Nightingale once tested beef tea on herself during a brief illness. She later described it as pleasant but lacking in true sustenance. That didn't stop her from recommending it to everyone else. She believed in its symbolic power, like lighting a candle in a church, not because it changes the heavens, but because it changes you. And hospitals needed symbolism, desperately. When the death rate was over 40%, you needed rituals to survive the numbers. Tea was one of them. But not everyone agreed with Florence. By the late 19th century, a new group of physicians began to push back. They argued that beef tea had no nutritional value, that it contained almost no albumin and next to no fat, meaning it couldn't sustain the sick the way porridge or milk could. One famously cranky medical journal called it the world's most overrated infusion. And yet, patients kept asking for it. Why? Because food isn't just chemical. It's cultural, emotional, contextual. Beef tea meant care. It meant attention. It meant someone hadn't given up. You lie back, the cup still half full in your hand. The taste is as familiar now as your own breath, salty, metallic, faintly greasy, but strangely calming. It's not good, but it's yours. You think of all the people across Britain sipping the same thing at this very moment. In city hospitals, in country infirmaries, in drawing rooms, in military tents. It's a drink that travels from hand to hand, from bed to bed, from hope to resignation and back again. And even as doctors grow skeptical, even as the science wavers, even as nutrition charts say no, the ladles keep moving. Beef tea outlived its critics. Through the 1880s and 1890s, it expanded its reach into schools, into prisons, into industrial workplaces. Factory girls were sometimes given a cup on cold mornings to stiffen their resolve. Railway workers drank it before long shifts. Priests gave it to the ill. Scientists studied it under microscopes, searching for proof that never quite appeared. Meanwhile, the sick just drank it, because it was warm, and because it was what they were given. By now, it was more than tradition. It was habit. It was, as one nurse put it, the steam that holds the ward together. And here, in your own ward, that steam lingers. It clings to the windows. It pools around your chest. It softens the sting of cold tile and hard straw. The cup is empty now. You set it down, carefully, the way you always do. Your eyelids feel heavy, not from the tea, there's no magic in it, but from the day, from the ache behind your eyes, from the rhythm of routine. You roll onto your side and listen to the room, the breathing, the snoring, the distant hiss of another pot being stirred. You think of Florence, of her lamp, of her obsession with order in a world that made no sense. You may not agree with her, but you understand her, because in this place, any ritual that makes things feel less random is worth holding on to. The frost has crept in through the corners of the window panes. Not real frost. It doesn't get cold enough in the ward for that, not quite, but the glass sweats like something is trying to escape or sneak in. You pull the blanket tighter over your shoulders and sit upright, waiting. The nurse arrives with your morning offering. She doesn't say good morning. No one in here does, but the clink of the cup on the tray is greeting enough. Beef tea again. Not a surprise. But today, the smell is different, smokier. There's a faint tang, like the inside of an old kettle. You sip it anyway. And in that moment, strangely enough, you're reminded that this taste, this tradition, this oily warmth wasn't limited to you, not to this hospital, not to this city, not even to this continent. Beef tea had gone global, and believe it or not, it had gone imperial. By the late 19th century, beef tea had become more than a Victorian comfort. It had become a logistical miracle. A foodstuff for the modern empire. The British Empire stretched across the globe. India, Australia, parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and everywhere it went it carried certain things. Uniforms, gin, Protestantism, and beef tea. Soldiers stationed in far-flung colonial outposts were often given jars or tins of condensed beef extract. It didn't require refrigeration. It could be reconstituted with boiling water. It made a thin, salty broth that tasted vaguely like England, or at least England's idea of restorative flavor. This wasn't just about nutrition. It was about identity. Beef tea was used to stabilize the weak, rehydrate the sick, and bring failing soldiers back to a point where they could stand up straight, salute, and go back to getting sunstroke in someone else's country. In India, it was often paired with lime juice to stave off scurvy. In South Africa, it was boiled thick, then chilled into a gelatin for men too injured to swallow liquids. In Australia, explorers carried tins of it as they marched into deserts they didn't understand. Quirky fact, Ernest Shackleton's 1909 Antarctic expedition took 2,000 tins of beef extract. They melted it over stoves made from salvaged sled parts. One surviving journal entry simply reads, "Tea at last, not real tea, but warmth, the kind that slows the thoughts." The imperial enthusiasm didn't stop there. Hospitals across the colonies adopted beef tea as standard fare. It was part of the civilizing mission. This odd British belief that the best way to care for the native sick was to give them what the empire itself relied on, diluted cow water. Historians still debate whether this was earnest compassion or culinary colonization. Either way, the idea was clear. Beef tea was English virtue in liquid form. It was nourishing, proper, rational, not spicy, not exotic. Just correct. That was the empire's favorite flavor. Correctness. Back in Britain, newspapers ran glowing reports of how beef tea was saving lives in the tropics. One article described a cholera-stricken village in Burma where the sick were miraculously revived with beef broth boiled in iron kettles shipped from Liverpool. Miraculous, that's a word you'll hear a lot. A better word might be persistent, because whether or not it worked, beef tea refused to disappear. It had reached hospitals, households, royal courts, and now the outer rim of empire. It was a drink, it was a doctrine, and it was big business. Enter the extract companies. Liebig's Extract of Meat Company, Liemco, founded in the 1860s, began bottling the vital essence of beef in neat glass jars with red and gold labels. It was advertised as concentrated life, and it wasn't cheap. A single jar cost more than a day's wages for a factory worker, but it was marketed as essential, scientific, moral. Mothers were told it would keep their children strong. Invalids were promised recovery. Soldiers were reminded it was what the Queen herself drinks. Quirky tidbit. Queen Victoria actually did endorse one brand. After being served a particularly fine cup of extract during an illness, she supposedly murmured, "Quite agreeable." And that, my friend, was all the marketing team needed. Soon, beef tea, as taken by Her Majesty, was plastered across London in bold block type. You can almost picture it now. The ad posters, the hand-painted signs above pharmacies, the newspaper columns filled with testimonials from respectable gentlemen in monocles declaring how beef tea restored their mothers, their daughters, their own vigor. One particularly dramatic testimonial read, "I was a shadow of myself. Then I sipped beef tea and felt the blood return." Was it true? Doubtful, but it was effective. By the 1890s, even America had caught the fever. U.S. hospitals began importing beef extract from Britain. Civil War veterans received it in convalescent homes. Chicago meatpacking companies launched their own versions. It wasn't a British thing anymore. It was a modern thing. But let's be clear, the tea you're drinking now, this is not the deluxe version. This is the institutional brew, bone-thin, barely seasoned, clinging to the memory of a cow that once lived on the wrong side of the pasture. Still, it connects you, not just to the empire, but to all the strange, determined people who clung to this flavor like it meant something. And maybe it did. Maybe it still does. Because when you're far from home, on a frozen plain, in a jungle hospital, in a prison ward, the taste of something familiar, even something bland, can be enough to bring you back to yourself. It's not about protein, it's about orientation. Who you are, where you come from, what cup you raise to your lips when everything else has fallen away. For the Victorians, that cup was often beef tea. You finish yours, it's gone lukewarm, but you barely noticed. The nurse passes again, collecting empties, nodding silently at each survivor. The cup clinks back onto the tray. The steam is gone, but the warmth lingers. The empire is far away. The explorers are long dead. The queen is a face on a coin, but the tea remains. And here, in this ward, in this bed, with this aching body and this still beating heart, you've taken your part in it. Just one more sip in the vast, slow river of tradition, trying to fix a pipe that can't be fixed. You blink through the grime-smeared glass and catch a slice of gray sky, the kind that never fully commits to rain or shine. The ward is cold. Your knees ache. The straw in your mattress has shifted again, forming lumps in all the wrong places. And as if on cue, the cup arrives, carried in by hands you don't recognize. A new nurse, fresh apron, nervous eyes. She sets the tray down with more force than necessary and hurries off without a word. The tea's darker than usual. That either means it's richer or someone burned it. You take a cautious sip. It's bitter and faintly chalky. You drink anyway. It's hard to talk about the rise of beef tea in the Victorian age without mentioning one particular man, Justus von Liebig, the German chemist who gave the world the idea that meat could be distilled down into science. Liebig was brilliant, eccentric, and just the right kind of persuasive. In the 1840s, he proposed that the nutritional value of food could be broken into its chemical components, proteins, fats, carbohydrates, revolutionary stuff. And he believed that meat, specifically beef, contained a special life force that could be extracted and preserved. Now, to be fair, Liebig never said you could make a meal out of beef water. He warned that beef tea lacked the actual protein of solid meat, but the idea got away from him. Companies took his name, stuck it on labels, bottled concentrated beef tea, and declared it Liebig's extract, even if he didn't approve the recipe. It was marketing genius. In Britain, the name Liebig became synonymous with health. Even if you didn't know who he was, you trusted the label. It sounded continental, educated, modern. Liebig's extract of meat was sold in chemists' shops, advertised in every major paper, and delivered by the crate to hospitals, orphanages, and colonial outposts. It wasn't cheap. A single ounce could cost as much as a whole loaf of bread, but it was considered clean, scientific, sanitized, and compared to what some hospitals were cooking on site, it probably was. Some of the marketing bordered on surreal. One ad showed a rosy-cheeked child drinking beef tea under a halo of light, while the words strength in every sip arched above his cherubic head. Another displayed a weary soldier crawling through battlefield mud, only to be rescued by a shining tin of beef extract glinting in his satchel. In truth, the product contained barely any nutrients, but it offered story, and story sells. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian mothers believed that if a baby tasted beef tea in its first year, it would grow up to be taller. One woman reportedly fed her infant nothing but beef tea and mashed turnips for a month. The child survived. Somehow. Doctors didn't mind the hype. Many welcomed it, because even if the science was shaky, the benefits were practical. Hospitals could now store beef tea without worrying about spoilage. No need to hire dedicated cooks. No concern over inconsistent bones or poorly tended pots. Just boil water, stir in extract, serve. In some wards, beef extract was mixed with milk, or eggs, or whiskey. One inventive nurse even added cinnamon and passed it off as a tonic for nerves. Historians still argue whether any of these concoctions helped, but patients kept drinking them. By the 1870s, the market was crowded. Other brands emerged: Bovril, Oxo, brand's essence of beef. Each claimed to be purer, stronger, more life-giving than the last. They came in brown glass jars with metal caps. Some had measuring spoons molded into the lid. One came with instructions in French for continental flair. Beef tea wasn't just medicine anymore. It was luxury. Fancy clinics served it in silver cups. The wealthy added it to soup courses at dinner parties. One fashionable London hostess reportedly served beef tea jelly between courses, set in a delicate mold, with parsley suspended inside. It was described as interesting, which is Victorian for weird but polite. You finish your cup. The chalky aftertaste lingers. You suspect the new nurse added too much extract powder, or not enough water, or maybe it's just another variation in the grand guessing game of institutional nourishment. Either way, you're warmer now. That's what matters. In a few minutes, the orderlies will come by. They'll ask who's had their broth, who's taken ill, who didn't wake up. And the cups will be washed, or rinsed, at least, and used again. In the background of all this commercial beef tea mania, there were quiet protests. Some physicians began to push back harder. They pointed to charts, nutrient counts, blood work. There is no protein here, one wrote. No fiber, no real value. But the momentum was too strong. Too many families believed in it. Too many patients took comfort in it. And too many hospitals found it convenient. So the protests became footnotes, and the tea kept flowing. It's easy now, from your stiff bed in a soot-streaked ward, to feel like a number in a ledger. One more spoonful in a sea of patients. One more silent mouth receiving the miracle cure that isn't. But you're also part of a story. A strange one, yes, but not a meaningless one. Because somewhere, right now, someone is heating water in a rusted pot, stirring in a dark extract, watching the steam rise, and hoping for just a moment that it will do what it promises. Give strength, restore life, or at the very least remind the drinker that they are still human. And still here, the cup doesn't arrive right away this morning. That's how you know something's wrong. Not with you, but with the system. When the tea is late, the kitchen has stumbled, or the ward's short-staffed, or someone important has died. You wait, you listen. No footsteps yet. The ward is hushed, not the sleepy hush of dawn, but the tense, brittle kind, like something has broken and no one wants to admit it. Finally, the tea appears without a nurse. Just a tray left by the door, 6 cups already half cold. You shuffle out of bed and retrieve your own. The handle burns a little against your fingers, but it's a welcome pain, a reminder that you still feel something. You sip. It's weak today, but that's fitting, because now we have to talk about what beef tea really cost. Not just in taste, not even in time, but in sheer, absurd economic strain. You see, beef tea wasn't cheap. Not to make, not to serve, not to sustain. A single cup, if done to Nightingale's original standards, required nearly a pound of beef. That's 8 ounces of actual muscle fiber, slow simmered and strained, and that's per person, per cup. Now multiply that by every bed in the ward, by every day of the week, by every city in the country. Victorian hospitals weren't just struggling to heal the sick. They were bleeding funds trying to keep everyone bathed in broth. Quirky fact, in one workhouse infirmary in Yorkshire, the monthly beef bill exceeded the cost of coal, linens, and soap combined. In response, some administrators ordered the tea diluted. Use bones, they said, trimmings. Some even suggested adding barley water or crushed biscuits to thicken it, though this made it more porridge than potion. The problem was philosophical as much as practical. Because beef tea had become expected, to remove it from the menu was to admit defeat, to say, we no longer provide comfort. And that was politically unpalatable. Charity hospitals leaned heavily on donors. Wealthy ladies would sponsor beef weeks in a given ward, their names written in calligraphy on chalkboards beside the beds. One particularly proud patron, Lady Mortimer of Devon, insisted her weekly beef be from grass-fed Herefords only. Another requested that her donated broth be served in Wedgwood china. Never tin. The staff rolled their eyes, but the patients didn't complain. Beef tea became a form of moral performance, a way for the upper classes to demonstrate their benevolence without having to touch the sick or smell the wards. It was compassion, outsourced. Meanwhile, in the poorer districts, hospitals scraped together what they could. Bones were begged from butchers. Leftovers were repurposed. In one infamous case, a dead cow from a nearby farm was boiled down for broth after having first been declared fit enough for extract, if not for table. The resulting tea was described as gray, cloudy, and with an unpleasant pellicle. That's Victorian for, this tastes like boiled shoe. Still, it was served. Because it had to be. Historians still debate whether this obsession with beef tea was rooted in genuine belief or social signaling. Was it medical treatment, or was it a theater of care performed for donors, families, and the mirror? Probably both. Because in Victorian society, visible effort mattered more than invisible impact. If you looked like you were caring, if you had the charts, the routines, the steaming pots, that was half the battle won, even if the patient still died. You sip again. It's barely warm now, but you've grown accustomed to the flavor, or lack thereof. The salt hits first, then a vague tang like overcooked iron, then nothing. But you keep drinking, because the routine helps, because it's what everyone expects, because the alternative is to do nothing, and that feels worse. You look around the ward, the others are doing the same, quietly, mechanically, as if the act of drinking tea together makes them less alone. And maybe it does. Let's not forget the staff. The nurses drank it too. So did the kitchen workers, and sometimes even the doctors, though usually as a show of camaraderie rather than genuine need. In the early hours of the morning, after long shifts tending to the sick and dying, exhausted nurses would huddle by the stoves, hands wrapped around mugs of cooling broth, not because it restored them, but because it grounded them. It was the drink you had when you couldn't handle coffee. The drink that didn't wake you up, but kept you up. It didn't stimulate, it steadied. And so the beef economy continued. Hospitals purchased cows by the dozen. Farmers learned which cuts were preferred. Whole industries sprang up around extract, packaging, and delivery. By the turn of the century, some hospitals had broth managers, staff members solely responsible for monitoring stock levels, ordering bones, and rationing fat. Menus were printed weekly, not with choices, but with instructions. Ward A, 10 pints daily. Ward B, 6 pints extra salt. Ward C, 1 fortified cup per new patient. It became a science, or at least a bureaucracy. You finish your tea. You set the cup down beside the bed. The tray is already half filled with others, some empty, some barely touched. A nurse walks by and glances. She notes something in her little book. You don't ask what. You don't need to. It's likely something simple. Drank all. Patient alert. Broth received. You lean back. The room is quiet again. Outside, the pipe hammering has stopped. Maybe the water's flowing again, or maybe something else is broken. But inside, the ritual continues. Another day, another cup. A currency of care in a world too thin on comfort. It's evening again. The gas lamps buzz softly overhead, casting yellow halos onto the cracked plaster ceiling. You lie still beneath your blanket, though blanket is generous, more like a threadbare cloth, patched so many times it's a history book in stitches. You're not sure what time it is, but you know it's late. Not from a clock, there isn't one, but from the stillness, from the way the nurses move, quieter, slower, from the way no one's trying to sit up anymore. And then it happens. A shape by your bedside. No tray this time, just a single cup held carefully in 2 hands. A nurse you know well, older, softer spoken, with eyes like worn linen, kneels down beside you. She doesn't speak, just offers the tea. You understand. You're not the only one. Across the ward, others are being served the same way. Not fed, not hurried, just accompanied. This is the cup. The final one. Not always, of course. Not officially. But in practice, this is what the last stage often looked like. One more serving of beef tea. One last attempt to give warmth, if not strength. One last moment of attention. Victorian hospitals had no morphine drips, no end-of-life consultations, no chaplains offering soft-voiced assurances that everything would be all right. They had beef tea, and sometimes that was it. In some wards, there were routines for this. If a patient was clearly fading, pulse weak, skin gray, breath shallow, the nurse would call for a quiet cup, not from the main pot, from the small one kept warm at the back of the stove, meant for the dying. It was made a little stronger, thicker, saltier, almost like a final act of mercy, not because it would help, but because it might comfort. One nurse's journal from 1891 describes the moment like this. At the end, I bring the broth. I hold the cup. If they sip, I stay. If they cannot, I hold their hand instead. No ceremony, no religion, just liquid warmth and silent company. Quirky fact, some families requested that beef tea be served to loved ones in their final moments, even if the patient was unconscious. They would want it, they'd say, or it was their favorite. You have to wonder, was it really about the tea, or about holding on to the illusion that something could still be done? Historians still argue whether the death cup was a gesture of dignity or simply routine dressed up as tenderness. But if you've ever held someone's hand when they couldn't speak anymore, you understand. It's not about outcome, it's about presence. There's something gentle about it. The way the nurse kneels, the way the tea is held with both hands, the way no one rushes even though everyone knows the clock is louder now. Some patients resist it, some turn their heads, some try to speak, but their mouths are too dry or their thoughts too tangled. But others, they sip, and in that moment everything slows down. For many Victorians, this became a kind of deathbed ritual. No final sermon, no final kiss, just the last cup of tea. One more breath, one more swallow. In poor houses, this was the only luxury the dying received. No family, no music, just broth, warm and thin, offered by a tired nurse who'd done this same thing 3 times already that week. In wealthier homes, it was the same, just served in fancier china. The cup didn't care about class. You sip now. It's warm, not hot. The salt hits your tongue first, then the meatiness, then the quiet. No one speaks. The nurse waits, kneeling beside you. You nod, barely. She nods back. She doesn't ask if it helps. That's not the point. This isn't a cure, it's an anchor. It says, you're still here. In some rare cases, patients rallied after the death cup. A few sips, a few hours of sleep, and then color returned. Breath steadied. A nurse would come in the next morning and find them sitting up. Doctors called it post-sip rallies. Nurses called it miracles. Statisticians called it anomalies. It didn't matter, because even if the tea didn't save you, it gave you something to hold on to while drifting. A line back to shore, even if you never made it. There were debates, of course, ethical debates. Some physicians believed the death cup created false hope, that it delayed grief, that it allowed families to say we tried even when they knew it was over. Others believed in it fully. One doctor wrote, "We cannot always heal, but we can always serve. And even if it is only with broth, it is not nothing." You may not know which camp you fall into, but here, in this bed, with this cup in your hands and this nurse beside you, the line between gesture and meaning feels very thin. Your cup is empty now. You place it gently on the tray. The nurse doesn't take it yet. She waits with you a moment longer. Then, with a soft hand on your blanket, she rises and moves to the next bed. You lie back. You aren't scared. Not anymore. Because even if this isn't the end, it could have been. And it would have been quiet, gentle, human. That's more than most get. And all you needed was a little warmth, a little salt, and one final sip. You don't wake up with a start this time, just a slow return, a blinking into the gaslight, a shuffle of thoughts finding their way back to order. The cup is already there, still warm. Someone must have placed it while you were asleep. Your hand reaches for it automatically. The smell is familiar, by now almost comforting. You sip. And with that small act, you do what so many in this ward have done before you, survive the night. But survival, as it turns out, doesn't mean recovery. It just means you're still here for the next round of questions. And today, the questions aren't just coming from the nurses. They're coming from the doctors. The new ones. The ones in long coats and wire-rimmed spectacles holding clipboards and frowning as they sniff the air. The ones asking, why are we still serving this? It's the late 1890s now. Medicine is changing. The germ theory is widely accepted. Antiseptics are common. Surgical gloves are, finally, a thing. X-rays have made their debut. There are whispers of actual hospitals becoming places where people leave better than they arrived. And so the old ways are being questioned. Beef tea included. Modern nutritionists start doing the math. And the math doesn't lie. An average cup of beef tea contains almost no protein, no fiber, minimal fat, barely any calories. One report from 1896 declares it a culinary illusion, resembling nourishment only by association. It hits hard, especially for an industry that's built half its identity on a cup of brown liquid. Some doctors defend it. It soothes, they argue. It hydrates. It calms the patient. But others counter, so does warm water. So does tea. So does being left alone to rest. Historians still argue whether these debates were driven by science or by pride. After all, it's difficult to let go of something that has defined your practice, your rituals, your image of care, especially when patients themselves still ask for it. Because patients don't think in calories, they think in comfort. You sip your tea again, you can't tell whether it's weaker than yesterday or if your senses are just tired. It hardly matters. What matters is the silence that follows, the space it creates around you. That's something the new doctors don't measure. They have charts, but you have moments. And right now, this moment is warm. Quirky fact, in 1903, one hospital in Kent tried to phase out beef tea by replacing it with something called meat tablets. They were dense, rubbery cubes made from boiled-down animal parts, designed to dissolve in hot water. They did not dissolve. They clumped. They floated. They bobbed around like deflated sponges. Patients refused to drink them. The experiment lasted 3 weeks. The nurses brought back the real tea without a word. Sometimes progress forgets the part where food should still taste like food. Still, the criticism continued. Medical journals published scathing articles with titles like The Myth of Beef Tea, Soup is Not Science, Death by Dilution, The False Promise of Broth. One particularly dramatic author compared beef tea to the placebo of the digestive system. Yet the patients, especially the elderly, the weak, the frightened, kept requesting it. And the nurses, caught between doctrine and dignity, kept serving it. Because if you've spent weeks vomiting, fainting, sweating through fevers, or gasping through fluid-filled lungs, you don't want a lecture. You want a warm cup, a familiar smell, something to hold. You roll your head to one side and see the tray of used cups, all different states, some sipped, some untouched, one overturned, the contents congealed into a gelatinous puddle. The nurse collects them carefully, noting which are empty, which are not. She doesn't judge, she just observes. That's how it's always been. Not healing, witnessing. And still, modern science marches forward. By 1910, nutritionists have established calorie minimums for recovery. Hospitals begin installing electric sterilizers. Pureed meals, fortified milk, and vitamin tonics start appearing on the menus. Beef tea is moved from essential to optional. It loses its place on the front lines of care. Not gone, but demoted. The pot still simmers, but further from the stove. The ladle still dips, but with less ceremony. In some places, it's still served with reverence. In others, it's served with an apologetic shrug. You finish your cup. The bottom is slick with residue. Brown and thin. You tip it back anyway, letting gravity do the last of the work. There's no applause, no fanfare, but the nurse notices. She smiles. "Good," she says softly. "You took all of it." You nod. Not because you feel stronger, but because that's what the script calls for. Because sometimes doing the thing is the only thing left to do. That's the strange truth about beef tea. It was never about what it was about what it meant. It was control, routine, kindness, helplessness. It was all the ways people tried to do something in a world where illness outpaced understanding. It was, above all, presence. Because when everything else has failed, when the body is frail, and the mind unsteady, and the future uncertain, a warm cup held to your lips is a kind of promise, a quiet one, but still a promise. And sometimes, that's enough. The rain started sometime during the night. You didn't hear it at first, not over the coughing and the nurse's shuffling feet, but now it's unmistakable, soft, persistent, tapping against the window pane like a child too polite to knock louder. The glass has fogged over. The world outside the hospital has disappeared into gray. You imagine a cart splashing through puddles, a nurse walking home beneath a sagging umbrella. Somewhere out there, life goes on. But in here, the cup returns, still warm, still brown, still slightly oily on the surface. You don't even need to lift your head. The nurse tilts it gently for you. You sip. You swallow. The taste is what it always is. Familiarity. Salt. Fat. Memory. And today, memory is doing a lot of work. Because we need to talk about the dark side of this tea. The part that wasn't about nourishment. The part that wasn't about kindness. The part where it became control. You see, beef tea wasn't just a food or a ritual. In some places it was a tool. Not to comfort the sick, but to manage them, contain them, silence them. In overcrowded hospitals and grim Victorian asylums, staff used it as a disciplinary measure, a diluted reward, a test of compliance. If you refused your tea, you were labeled uncooperative. If you spat it out, delirious. If you begged for something else, bread, milk, anything, they told you beef tea was all you were allowed, that you had to earn more. It became the line between care and control. This was especially true in mental wards. Patients deemed unmanageable were often restricted to liquid diets, not for their health, but to make them easier to handle. No chewing meant fewer utensils. Less chewing meant less mess. Less mess meant less time spent on patients the staff had already given up on. In these places, beef tea wasn't restorative. It was administrative. It filled stomachs, quieted voices, gave the illusion of effort. And if a patient still declined, it went in through a funnel or a rubber tube. No sip, no swallow, no say. Historians still debate the ethics of this. Was it pragmatic care for those who couldn't feed themselves? Or was it cruelty in the guise of consistency? Probably both, because like so many things in the Victorian medical world, it depended entirely on who you were. Let's say you were a poor woman, no family, no dowry, found weeping in the street, declared hysterical and committed to an institution. You'd be stripped, deloused, placed in a cold room, given a number, a bed, and a tin cup. The tea would arrive 3 times a day, thin, tasteless, your only food, your only warmth. And when you asked for more, when you tried to explain that you weren't mad, just hungry, they told you to drink your tea and rest. That was the answer to everything. In some places, the rationing became absurd. Hospitals used beef tea to ration care itself. Nurses were instructed to focus on patients who responded positively to broth. In other words, if you drank it without complaint, you were considered treatable. If you didn't, you weren't worth the time. One infirmary even kept a list: tea compliant, observe, tea refusal, transfer. Transfer meant the annex, or worse. Quirky fact: a London workhouse in 1888 had a rule that no bread shall be served until 2 full ladles of broth are consumed. This included children. Some tried to hide the tea under their blankets. Others poured it into chamber pots. One girl was caught dumping hers behind a loose brick in the wall. She was beaten with a broom, and yet it wasn't always malicious. Some staff believed the tea really was all they could offer. That bread would cause vomiting. That milk would spoil in the heat. That chewing took strength patients didn't have. That beef tea was the safest thing, the only thing they could give. In some places, they were probably right. But intent doesn't always cancel impact. And when a cup becomes the only currency, it stops being care and starts becoming control. You lie back now, the tea settling in your stomach like a pebble in a well. You can feel it sitting there, heavy, thin, real. You're lucky today. You drank by choice. No one forced your jaw open. No one strapped you down. But the echo of those others, those voices that went unheard, those cups that were weapons rather than gifts, it lingers. Because beef tea wasn't always about kindness. Sometimes it was about quieting the noise. Sometimes it was about making the dying disappear more neatly. You hear a commotion down the hall, a nurse arguing with someone, a name you don't recognize, a plea. A metal tray dropped, silence. Then footsteps, then nothing. Another patient refusing tea, maybe. Another mark in a book. Another number downgraded from hopeful to difficult. You clutch your cup a little tighter, because now you know, it's not just broth. It's a mirror. It reflects what the system thinks of you, what it's willing to give, what it's trying to take away. But still, there's one more side to this. Because even in the hands of cruelty, even in the shadow of indifference, sometimes the tea was still warm, still held with care, still given, not forced. Sometimes, despite the system, a nurse bent the rules. A cook added a pinch more salt. A patient sipped and felt for just one moment human again. And that makes the story harder, because it's not about the tea. It never was. It's about what you do with it. It's Sunday. You only know that because the tea comes in a porcelain cup today. One of the older ones, cracked at the handle, rim spider-webbed with hairline fractures, but unmistakably porcelain. You trace it with your finger before lifting it to your lips. The taste is the same. The ceremony is not, because today they're calling it a treat. You glance around the ward and notice the difference immediately. A sprig of lavender on the windowsill. A nurse humming to herself while collecting linens. Even the broth smells slightly better. Richer, if only just. It's subtle, but intentional. Today, they're pretending this is a gift. Let's talk about that. By the end of the Victorian era, beef tea had trickled upward. What started as a humble broth for the sick and dying became a fashionable indulgence for the very much alive. In London, private clinics served it in china cups with silver spoons. Wealthy invalids took it in drawing rooms, wrapped in shawls, speaking softly about their convalescence as if it were a spiritual retreat rather than a medical event. Beef tea became genteel, a way for the upper classes to flirt with fragility without descending into filth. The difference was in the details. In public wards like yours, the tea came lukewarm, in dented tins, handed out by overworked nurses with ink-stained ledgers. But in private care, it arrived on a silver tray, covered by a cloth, accompanied by dry toast or lightly buttered fingers of sponge cake. One aristocrat's journal from 1894 describes her post-appendicitis routine. A cup of beef tea precisely at 3:30 taken on the veranda. Nurse Abigail ensures it is served just as I like it, clear, hot, and not a speck of fat. Clear, hot, no fat. That was the gold standard of broth-based luxury. There were even beef tea parties. No, really. Groups of ladies gathered to sip broth and exchange stories of fainting spells, weak constitutions, and recommended sanatoriums. Quirky fact: one fashionable hostess in Brighton insisted her guests wear pale blue to enhance the appearance of delicacy. She served beef tea in etched crystal cups and hired a violinist to play slow, sad waltzes in the background. Because nothing pairs with protein water like performative fragility. And the gentlemen weren't far behind. Doctors began prescribing beef tea not just for illness, but for stress, overwork, neural fatigue. What today we might call burnout, they called brain fever. The cure? Reclining on a chaise longue while a housemaid brought you precisely 8 ounces of steaming broth. It wasn't medical, it was theatrical. Beef tea became the liquid version of a doctor's note, a socially acceptable way to pause the chaos of empire building and say, I'm fragile, but in a very elegant way. You sip your own tea and try to imagine all this. The fine china, the silver trays, the string quartets. You smile, not because it's funny, but because in your mouth the broth still tastes like boiled string. No amount of crystal stemware can change that. Still, the power of perception is real, because if someone tells you something is a comfort, enough times, in the right tone, with the right presentation, you start to believe it. And in believing it, you begin to feel better. Not healed, but contained. Some hospitals leaned into this. They redesigned their servingware, trained nurses to smile during delivery, dimmed the lights, placed flowers on the trays. One innovative matron in Edinburgh began painting the cups with little bluebirds. For cheer, she said, even if the tea is dreadful. And the strangest part, patients responded. They sipped more, complained less, smiled. Was it the tea or the care? Historians still debate it. Of course, not everyone was fooled. Some patients, especially the long-term ones, began to see the theater for what it was. They knew the tea hadn't changed, just the cup. And while they appreciated the effort, they also saw the truth. No toast, no tray, no stitched embroidery could turn a dying ward into a drawing room. But sometimes pretending helped, just for a while. You set your cup down and notice it leaves no stain on the tray. That's new. Someone polished it this morning. Probably the same someone who arranged the lavender. You close your eyes and breathe deeply. The scent is subtle, sweet, almost enough to mask the vinegar in the air. Almost. Quirky fact: one Victorian etiquette guide suggested serving beef tea to house guests who arrived unwell from travel. It instructed hosts to offer it with a warm cloth for the face and a whispered inquiry, "May I offer you a restorative?" The same book, a few pages later, suggests airing out the guest room with laudanum-soaked linens. It was an age of contradictions. The tea is gone now, but the feeling lingers. Not fullness, not energy, but quiet. That's what Sunday broth is for. Not strength, but softness. A moment of pretending everything is fine, that the bed is clean, that the tray is polished, that the lavender means something, and maybe, just for today, that's enough. Because in this place, dignity isn't in the ingredients. It's in the gesture, in the way the cup is held, in the way it's placed beside you, not tossed, and in the hope that someone, somewhere, still believes you deserve it. The light outside has turned that strange yellow-gray, what passes for sunset in this part of town. The clouds hang low over the rooftops like they've given up trying to move. In the ward, the lamps are already lit, their glow soft but insistent, pooling on the floorboards like spilled honey. It's your last cup of the day, maybe the last one ever. You don't know. No one says as much. But there's a finality in how it's delivered. Quietly, gently, with 2 hands and a glance that lingers just a little longer than usual. You accept it without a word. It's warm, still steaming faintly. You raise it to your lips. And as you sip, you realize just how far this cup has traveled. Not just from kitchen to cot, but across time, class, countries, bodies, from charity wards to royal courts, from field hospitals to sanatoriums, from the mouths of orphans to the hands of explorers trudging through snow. This cup has history, and it has ghosts. You think about all the moments it's carried, all the contradictions it's held. It was care, it was control, it was comfort, it was discipline, it was belief, it was denial. It was what they gave when they had nothing left to give, and somehow it became everything. There are no more arguments now, no doctors debating protein values, no nutritionists weighing ounces against outcomes, no newspaper ads proclaiming miracles. The pot still simmers, but it's more out of habit than hope. Modern medicine has moved on, toward IVs, nutrients, precision, and pills. But in the small corners of older wards, the tea remains. Out of respect, out of rhythm, out of memory. You finish your tea slowly, no rush, letting the warmth settle in your belly like a slow exhale. Around you, the ward begins its nighttime routine. A nurse dims the lamps. An orderly shuffles past with folded linens. Someone moans softly in sleep. Everything is slower at night, quieter, less sharp. Even the floorboards creak more softly, as if they've learned to tiptoe around the dying. Quirky fact, one rural infirmary in Wales kept a tradition into the 1920s. Every Sunday evening, just after prayers, the matron would read aloud the names of patients who had passed that week. After each name, a nurse would place an empty cup on the mantel above the stove. By morning, the cups were washed, but for one night they sat in silence, like gravestones, but gentler. Beef tea was never about the living or the dead. It was about the in-between, and that's where you are now. Not well, not gone, just here, breathing, waiting, warming your hands around a cup that tastes of history. You think of all the hands that held this before you, the nurses, the cooks, the patients who whispered thanks, the ones who stared blankly ahead. You think of the mothers spoon-feeding their children, of the soldiers with trembling fingers, of the old men who refused to sip, and the girls who tried to swallow it just to feel grown. You think of the rooms that looked like this one, the beds that felt like yours, the sounds, coughing, clinking, rustling, that haven't changed in 200 years. You're part of that now. Not a patient, not just, but a witness. A thread in a long, strange tapestry of steam, salt, and soft sighs. You close your eyes. The cup is empty, but your hands still cradle it, unwilling to let go just yet. There's something sacred about the final swallow. Not dramatic, not divine, just honest. Because no matter how useless the tea might have been, how nutritionally bankrupt, how theatrically overvalued, it meant something to someone. To many, to you. The nurse returns. She doesn't speak, just touches your shoulder lightly. She takes the cup. She carries it away like it's full of something fragile. It is. You lie back. The pillow is still lumpy, the blanket still thin, but the moment is full. Not because you're cured, not because you're saved, but because you were seen. And that's what the tea was always really about. So now, you let yourself sink, just a little deeper into the mattress. Let the room fade. Let the rain outside slip into a soft, rhythmic hush. You've heard every cough, you've seen every tray, you've touched every crack in the porcelain, and still, you're here. That matters, because this story wasn't about beef, or broth, or even illness. It was about the quiet ways people try. Try to help, try to comfort, try to make meaning from days that feel empty, with cups, with spoons, with silence. And when you think about it like that, it's easier to rest. You don't have to make sense of everything. You don't have to finish the whole cup. You don't have to be strong tonight. You just have to be here. In this soft, strange moment, in this little piece of borrowed peace, let the ward settle around you. Let the ghost of lavender hover in the air. Let the footsteps of nurses become slower, softer, distant. There will be another tray tomorrow, or there won't. There will be another story, or there won't. But for now, you've heard this one, and that's enough, so rest your head. Let the broth settle. Let the past fade. Let your breath fall into rhythm with the world outside your window. You did well today. You listened. You sipped. You stayed. And now, let go. Sweet dreams, my friend. May your sleep be deep, your mind quiet, and your blanket just heavy enough to feel safe. I'll be right here when you're ready for the next story.